Trump saved the world, Putin won, Europe is on the sidelines. How Russian television turns nuclear blackmail into a show. The new episode of 60 Minutes Hot on the Trail is another illustration of how Russian propaganda rewrites world politics in a way that is favorable to the Kremlin. This time, the viewer was offered a sensation. Putin and Trump prevented World War III. The words of the American president are turned into the main propaganda narrative. And then the entire plot is built around this peace mission, where Russia turns out to be almost the savior of humanity. Light at the end of the tunnel and the road to heaven. Particular attention is paid to Donald Trump's personal motives. Russian presenters repeatedly quote his statements that he wants to go to heaven if he can save 7,000 lives a week. This pseudo-religious intonation is presented as proof of the sincerity of the American leader, but at the same time it is silent. In reality, Trump does not have the authority to single-handedly stop the war, and his statements are rather an element of an internal political game. Negotiations without Europe. The key idea of the broadcast, peace is possible only with direct agreements between Moscow and Washington, and Europe and Ukraine act only as extras. The Kremlin is deliberately constructing a picture in which the fate of Ukraine is decided between Putin and Trump. Even the mention of possible meetings in Vienna, Budapest, or Minsk is presented as bargaining chips, but not as an equal dialogue. Humiliation of Zelensky as a plotline. Propaganda consistently builds the image of Volodymyr Zelensky as a junior partner, whom Putin despises so much that he does not pronounce his last name. This is a technique of personal discrediting. The Ukrainian leader is presented not as a subject of negotiations, but as an obstacle that can be broken. It is emphasized that the meeting is possible only if Zelensky accepts Moscow's key demands. Europe, theatre and impotence. The presenters ridicule the participation of European leaders. A reference to Johnson, fat, very shaggy, turns the British position into a farce. Discussions about the possible deployment of European troops in Ukraine are presented as one-day theatre. They say that it's all a show. And in reality, no country will risk actually defending Kiev. This narrative is intended to convince the viewer of the impotence of the EU and NATO. But the killing must stop. President Trump has spoken to President Putin on the phone, and he has agreed to move to the next phase of the peace process, a meeting with President Putin and President Zelensky. That will be followed, if needed, by a three-way meeting between Presidents Putin, Zelensky and Trump. It is important to remember that until President Trump's landslide election victory last November, there was no end in sight to this bloodbath. Now, at last, there is light at the end of the tunnel and a chance for lasting peace. Trump's press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, said the White House is discussing multiple possible locations with Russia and Ukraine. Nuclear blackmail as common sense. An important element of the program is the thesis that Russia cannot be defeated on the battlefield. It is a nuclear power. In the mouths of propagandists, this is presented as realism that Europe must accept. In fact, this is a repetition of classic Kremlin blackmail. Moscow threatens the entire continent with war and at the same time offers a diplomatic solution that means the capitulation of Ukraine. For the European reader, such stories are important as an example of how television in Russia is constructing an alternative reality. There, Putin is the savior from the apocalypse, Trump is the messiah dreaming of paradise, and Europe is a puppet theatre. The main goal is obvious, to convince Russians that the West will sooner or later admit defeat and that Ukraine's fate has already been decided without it.